A little while ago, we looked at Adobe's new podcast beta. It allowed for some basic AI editing and a mic check. But what if you want to edit your current audio you've recorded on your computer, or on a mobile phone, or a handheld recording device, wherever it might be from? Well, in this video, I'm going to take you through my steps for basic audio editing. So the important thing to always remember when it comes to audio is that the best way to get good quality audio is to record good quality audio. Make sure you're recording in a space that you have some control over. Make sure you're capturing the best possible quality you can with the equipment you have. That doesn't mean that you have to spend a load of money. You can buy expensive equipment, but similarly, if you can control the room well enough, then a mobile phone or handheld recorder can get you perfectly usable results when it comes to adding small bits of voiceover to e-learning or a simple podcast. Now, if you're looking to start a career as a voiceover artist, you may need to invest a little more, and over time you'll probably find that you do want some audio equipment to support your work. But when you're just getting started, if you can capture noise, record it, digitize it, and get it onto the computer, that's all you need. So, I'm going to record directly into the computer for this example, for voiceover, and then we'll go from there. Let's jump in. So in this example, you can see I'm using Adobe Audition, probably one of, if not the most broadly used audio editors out there, as it's part of the Creative Cloud. Now, I know not everyone has access to the Creative Cloud, but it is fairly commonplace. The good news is everything that we do here can also be mirrored in Audacity, which is free and open source. So the first thing we need to do is get our bearings. Now, as with all Adobe software, you can curate the view that you want, but here I've just got the default with the Essentials panel closed because I don't need it. That gives me this large area in the center. This will be where my waveform and my mixer, and if we were to do a multi-track recording, then all of the waveforms for each track would show. And then on the left-hand side, I have my media area where all my files will show, my changeable area, which I tend to keep on effects rack, and some additional information down here, which we won't really be using today. Along the bottom here, you have the levels bar. This basically shows you how loud something is. As always with audio, we don't want it hitting the end and clipping or peaking, as that can cause distortion and crackles, but we don't want it so quiet that no one can hear it, so it's nice to have this big and clear at the bottom. You'll see that in action in just a moment. You can also see here in the bottom right that we have the kind of current selection in terms of time codes, what we're viewing versus what the full thing is and what the duration is. Again, really simple but useful information when editing. And then just down here at the bottom we have our general sort of play, stop, pause and record controls. When it comes to recording audio directly into Adobe Audition, it's really simple. I right-click in the Files browser, go to New, and then I can choose Multi-Track Session if I've got loads of tracks already loaded, Audio File, or CD Layout. For this, we're going for Audio File. It'll ask me to name it. It asks me to choose the sample rate. Now, you will need to choose a sample rate that matches the audio interface that you are using. So when you set up your specific audio interface, part of that will be selecting the sample rate. For me, it is 4800, so I'm going to leave that as it is. You should set it to whatever yours is to make sure there's not a discrepancy there. Channels is about how many lines of data we've got coming in, mono, stereo, or 5.1 or something custom. For 99% of us, we're going to be recording in mono. If you are recording in stereo though, select that. It just depends on the interface and the inputs you're using. But I'm recording in mono. And then we have bit depth. My advice is to leave this on 32 float. What that means is it will attempt to record in the highest possible bit depth, or bit rate as we might otherwise call it, but will adjust if it finds that your interface or your setup for whatever reason cannot support 32-bit. So with that done, we can click OK, and we can see now this view has slightly changed. Our Ideas intro test title is now up here and in blue, showing that that is the current waveform that we are viewing. This track now has lines all over it, which basically show progression once you started recording, and the red line running through the middle here shows you the centre of any sound wave that we capture. Starting recording is super simple. All we're going to do is come down to the bottom, hit the record button, and we'll be away. So, here we go. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. And there we are. We've captured our recording. Now, the first thing that strikes you about this recording is that it looks rather small, doesn't it? And there are a number of reasons for that. The microphone that I'm using, specifically the Shure SM7B, is not a particularly powerful microphone. And when I say powerful, I don't mean that it's not a good microphone. It's a great microphone. But what it doesn't do is boost the signal much. It is in fact notoriously quiet. Quite often this results in people applying a lot of gain early in the recording chain, or using what's called a cloud booster or dynamite plug to really boost the amplitude or the volume of the recording. Now, I don't do any of that because where I'm recording directly into a computer, it's much easier and much safer for me to capture the original recording as it comes out of the mic relatively quiet, and then boost it up later. This makes it far less likely that I capture any distortion or clipping or peaking. So, the first thing we need to do then is make it really loud. Except, no, not really. The first thing we need to do is listen to it back. Now, it's easy to think when we talk about listening back to audio that we just play it through speakers or earbuds or whatever, and we've got an idea of what we've recorded. And that's partially true. But think about how you're listening to that audio. If you're listening to it through earbuds, which are usually commercial type headphones as opposed to kind of workspace headphones, what that tends to mean is that they don't have a particularly clean or passive signal. They will usually be adding and taking away without you really knowing it. For example, it's generally regarded that something like Beats by Dr. Dre, for example, are very popular headphones, very expensive headphones, but you won't ever really see them being used by people working in professional audio because they massively increase the bass or lower frequencies in what you're listening to. Therefore, from an editing perspective, they're of very little use. You're not really hearing what you've captured. The idea when you listen back in a recording situation is that you want to, as much as possible, hear exactly what has been recorded. Now, when you share this recording, you unfortunately can't control how everyone else hears it. Everyone will use whatever they've got, their own headphones, their own speakers, whatever it might be. But by editing to the closest thing to a single point of truth that there is in audio, you maximise the chances that everyone, or at least as many people as possible, have a really good listening experience. Now, that said, you do not need to rush out and buy the world's most expensive monitoring headphones. For the last kind of 15, 16, maybe even 17 now years, I've used a simple set of Sennheiser HD 600s. Now, these may or may not be good for you because they are open-backed. That means that I need to have pretty good control of the environment in which I'm editing audio. Luckily, I have an office in which I do have that control. If you don't, consider getting a closed-back headphone. One thing I would advise avoiding is getting in-ear headphones. It is very difficult to find in-ear headphones that do not do something quite dramatic to the sound. Usually, at the very least, they massively boost the volume just because of the inherently small speakers that they have. And what you'll find is the more detailed you become in editing, the more difficult it is to hear the difference in those small speakers. These much larger speakers are just clearer when it comes to hearing small details. You'll also find that if you are wearing them for 3, 4, 5, 6 hours in a go, these will remain reasonably comfortable. In-ear headphones, for some, might be, but for most are not. Certainly, I really struggle with in-ear headphones after 45 minutes to an hour. And if they're wireless, you'll find they run out of battery pretty quick. So let's jump back in and listen to that recording. So with our headphones on, we can now listen back. Let's see what we got. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. So, a nice, clean recording, but definitely a little quiet. I'm happy with the overall recording there, and really what I'm listening for are, obviously, excessive background noise, any distortions or crackling that could have been caused by mobile phones near the microphone or the cable or the interface, or someone opening a door in the background while you're recording. But I'm also listening for things like plosives and sibilants. So plosives are when you make certain letters like P's and T's, it's quite forceful in terms of the amount of air and the speed at which you push it out. Now, when that hits a microphone, it can create a big popping sound. We call that a plosive. Some people are more likely to create a plosive than others, just based on how they speak. A couple of ways you can deal with that. One is a pop filter. Those are the kind of fabric stretched over a circle that you sometimes see put in front of a microphone. As the air hits that fabric, it naturally breaks up that wave and prevents it hitting the microphone with so much force. For some people that works, for some people it doesn't, for some microphones it works, for some microphones it doesn't. You have to kind of experiment and figure that out. The other approach is actually not to talk directly into the microphone, but to move the microphone to roughly a 45-degree angle, just slightly off axis, still pointing towards the person speaking, but meaning they're speaking past the microphone, allowing the microphone to pick up their voice, but that plosives sail straight past it. Usually, a combination of these two works really well, but there are some microphones, like high-end large diaphragm condenser microphones, that a lot of singers or professional voiceover artists use, that this would not be a good fit for. They need to be situated directly in front of the speaker, and so a pop filter is the only way. You can also, if you want to, engage in vocal training to reduce the likelihood that you yourself create a plosive, though that is an endeavour that most of us in the L&D world don't really have time for. The other thing I mentioned, sibilance, is really just related to the noise we create when we create S's in our sound. Some people are very tight and they go S, and it's done, but you can hear in my voice when I try, there is still a certain amount of S at the end. That can be unpleasant in a recording, and it's something you need to look out for. Now, I'll be honest and say that there's really very little you can do if there's a lot of sibilance captured in a recording. A compressor will help, we'll hear that later on, but really you want to try and be as clear and concise as you can when doing the original recording. So, we're happy with this, but we're not going to immediately boost the volume. Instead, we're going to start with a different step, specifically a bit of a tidy up. We don't need any of this empty space here, and we don't need any of this empty space here. Now, if there are any recording errors, this is also where I would chop those out and time everything together. Here, there are no errors, so I'll leave everything as it is. I don't want to waste time editing audio that I then delete. Next thing I'm going to do is select the entire waveform just by double clicking. You could also click and drag across the whole screen, but double clicking is usually easier. I'm going to go up to Effects and I'm going to apply our first effect, a parametric equalizer. Now, the parametric equalizer is really just a fancy name for a visual equalizer. You may or may not be familiar with the concept that sound is made up of a bunch of different frequencies. And what an equalizer allows us to do is not only visualize those frequencies, but specifically edit them, i.e. boost or reduce different frequencies within the recording. Now, you can see here this blue curve. This is the EQ curve I have assigned, specifically speaking to me, speaking through my SM7B mic, which is what we did this recording on. So let me show you the difference. First of all, let's turn it off and let's play that recording. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. And now let's go back to the start, turn that on, and play again. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. This is the Ideas Podcast, and off the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. Now you'll see that is not a colossal change. It's a slight change. You don't want to be making massive, sweeping changes through equalization. That's how you end up with a kind of robotic or inhuman voice. What you want to do is figure out where in the voice you've lost some of the natural dynamics, because a microphone will inherently have what's called a pickup pattern and a frequency curve. Now, the pickup pattern dictates what gets picked up and how close to the microphone you need to be and in what direction it records. The frequency curve tells us how that microphone records. What frequencies does it record a lot of? What frequencies does it cut down? Equalization is as much about getting your voice back to being normal as it is about creating a more professional sound. Here you can see in the bottom end, we've rolled off pretty much entirely the bottom 80 Hertz. Now, that generally speaking is below the range of most human hearing. The very top end of that, kind of 70 to 80, really just muddies up the sound. So we cut all of that out as much as possible. We certainly quiet it down. But we then put a little bit of a boost right at the lowest end, just to re-establish some clarity at the bottom of the voice. There's a little dip here around this number 3, you can see it around 302 Hertz. That's actually there to cut out some reflective sound that I know specifically exists within my office. But you're pretty much always going to want to dip somewhere around there to establish a cleared separation between the bass and the mid frequencies. As we move along then, the mid gets a slow and gradual boost because this particular microphone favours recording the bottom end and the top end. And then I actually put a fairly sizable boost on the top end because I know my voice doesn't have that much activity at that end, and so adding it artificially just crispens it up ever so slightly. Now, a lot of this, as you heard, had to do with me, my microphone, my voice, my recording style, and my space. And that means that when it comes to equalization, you will need to find what works for you. The good news is this is free. Record some stuff and start playing around with it. Pretty much every equalizer will come with a whole bunch of presets that you can start from and then start playing with. Then when you're happy, you can start saving presets. If you know you're going to be recording the same people in the same place often, make use of that and create presets for them. In this case, we are done. Let's apply that, and you can see how it's really impacted the waveform. The visualization of the waveform is a really useful tool to be able to see exactly how much change you're creating. So next up, let's deal with this volume issue. This is now sounding okay, but very, very quiet. Let's go back to effects and amplitude and compression. Next up, we will go down and select the normalize process. Now, normalization is not just cranking up the volume. Instead, we normalize to a preset position. I like -1.1. Remember, when dealing with audio editing, you always measure your volume in minus decibels from 0 backwards. And so -1.1 is my standardized volume for everything. You could also do this as a percentage of total, at which case you're looking at 88.1, but I prefer to work in decibels just because it's clearer. When we apply that, what it's going to do is increase the volume or amplitude, but keep everything in line with where it should be. Everything has been done kind of in proportion to the original recording. And because of that, what we should have done is now have a much clearer recording, but not picked up any distortion. Let's take a listen. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. This is the Ideas Podcast. That's already sounding pretty good, and now it's a bit louder, much clearer. But we're not done yet. Increasing the amplitude has revealed a couple of things. One, we have a breath that just sounds a little bit unpleasant in the recording. And two, we've picked up some background noise. First things first, let's deal with that breath. And this is where the waveform visualization really is handy, because we can see it right there. We can select it and give it a listen. Yep, not particularly pleasant. And then all we do is take the volume for that particular section and drag it down to 0. So now, when we play that space podcast, the show where there's now just a gap. Now, currently, that sounds a bit odd, and that's because in the spaces you can really hear some background noise. Let's take a listen over here. Warning, you can kind of hear a gentle hiss going on. So, let's tackle that next. Select the whole recording, go up to Effects, and go down to Noise Reduction and Restoration. I'm going to use the denoise tool here because this is not a particularly aggressive bit of background sound. Now, if you do have more background noise going on, you could use the noise print and noise reduction process. That is much more granular, much more involved, but just not necessary for this. And remember, the more you process sound, the less human it will generally become. So I want to keep processing to the bare minimum. So let's go to denoise, and we're going to keep this playing on a loop as we adjust the settings. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where... So you can see there, the noise is completely gone. However, this is set relatively high, and what we want to do is get rid of the noise whilst doing the minimum change possible. So I'm going to drop this to half of what it is, down to 10%, and then see how it sounds. Our instructional designers discuss. That has come back a little bit, so let's nudge that up, 13% ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, I'm happy that's gone. So, with that done, we can assess whether or not we need to adjust the output gain. I'm going to let it play a little longer and just monitor this meter here. Other beverages may be consumed. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. So I don't feel that that's making any major impact, so what I can do is leave that as it is. If we were having to do a lot more of this, if this was much higher on the scale, what we might see is a reduction in overall amplitude. If that were the case, we could use this makeup gain to slightly turn everything up in accordance with the impact the effect was having. Here we don't need to, so let's click Apply. Again, very little change there, but we can definitely hear the change in that background noise has pretty much gone. This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where instructional designers discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning. One thing to bear in mind when it comes to background noise is that a little bit of background noise is okay. Think about the world in which we live, there's always some noise going on. Total silence is an incredibly rare thing. Chances are, wherever people are listening to your recording is itself not totally silent. So my advice would be do not obsess over every little thing. Remove anything that gets in the way, remove anything that's distracting, remove anything that makes the voiceover unclear, but don't worry about attaining perfect silence in the background. So what we've now done is really the first half of my audio editing process. We've equalized and then we've normalized. Cleanup is an optional middle section, though it's pretty common. So what we've effectively done is E, N, and C. C being cleanup. Next up, we have another C. In this case, though, it's not cleanup, it's compression. Now, I think compression is probably one of the worst understood and worst used audio editing elements, usually because it's overused, to be honest. Either everything gets compressed or nothing gets compressed, or people think compressors are going to immediately make everything sound wonderful. And to be fair, compressors, when used right, can really elevate the quality of a recording. But let's talk about what a compressor actually does. All a compressor does is even out your waveform. Not completely, but slightly. It moves the quietest things closer to the amplitude of the loudest things and the loudest things closer to the amplitude of the quietest things, without losing the vocal dynamic. Applied badly, you'll completely use it. You'll squash everything to being exactly the same volume throughout the whole thing, and that's just going to sound terrible. You want natural variation in amplitude, but not too much. What this really allows you to do is make sure that the very quietest components can be heard clearly, with the loudest components not being so loud that they're painful. When you see this done badly is when you can't watch a film in the evening because some things are so massively loud whilst conversation is massively quiet. Let's take a look at it on the system. First thing we're going to do is select our waveform, head up to Effects and go to Amplitude and Compression. Now on every single tool there will be tons of options about how you apply a compressor. In this particular tool, one of the most common ways is to go into Dynamics and set it there, but I actually like to use the multiband compressor and I will tell you why. The multiband compressor allows me to set different compression settings for different frequency bands. For me, that is fantastic because I personally find that applying one flat compressor across recordings of my voice in this office does not turn out so well. So let me talk to you about the settings involved in a compressor. First things first, a compressor is not always on. It's activated based on certain volumes. In this situation, we're seeing the threshold is set at -20.2. That is really quiet. And in this scenario, what we've asked it to do is add gain of 1 dB. Specifically, we've asked it to add it in a ratio of 3:1. That establishes how much of a difference we want to make. The higher the ratio, the bigger the boost we're going to see. Next up, we have attack. Attack is how quickly the compressor is turned on or applied once the threshold is reached. Now, a long attack means you get perhaps a bit of a gap, very quiet, and then it gets louder. A short attack means that the minute this threshold is reached or hit, the compressor will come on. 1 millisecond is about as quick as it's going to be. The release is the reverse of that. How long do you want the compressor to stay on once that threshold is no longer being reached? Usually you would just have one of these for the entire track, but the multiband compressor allows you to set these based on these different frequency bands. This is really helpful. Now this is set up from when I last did a piece of recording, so let's see how that sounds. First of all, remind ourselves what it's like without this. This is the Ideas Podcast. Turn it on and listen to that same piece. This is the Ideas Podcast. You can immediately hear that's quite a sizable difference. And what this really does, in my mind, is give you that kind of over the radio or professional voice feel. It's not, however, a silver bullet. If you apply this poorly, without considering the settings, and without editing the audio well first, all you're doing is boosting up different messy areas of audio. So, I'm happy with this. I knew these settings would be about right because I've used them before. However, as with everything else we've discussed, the best thing to do is to start with a preset and play about from there. I particularly like Classical Master and Broadcast. Broadcast if you want a slightly beefier lower end, Classical if you want a more maybe music friendly vocal adjustment. So I'm going to apply that. And you can see that's immediately changed the waveform quite dramatically. A lot of our quieter pieces are now noticeably larger. A lot of our louder pieces have got slightly larger, but not massively so. This does, however, render a little bit of a problem. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. This is now very loud. There are elements of this that for me are uncomfortably loud. And so what we can do is, as we did earlier, go back to Effects, come to Amplitude and Compression, and Normalize. We're going to use exactly the same setting again. We're going to normalize to the same point, -1.10, hit Apply, perfect. Now the major benefit of using Normalize, rather than just adjusting the volume, is that if I record 3 different people on 3 different days on 3 different microphones, but normalize them all to the same volume, then I should get 3 recordings that I can, broadly speaking, allowing for other editing, use together in a cohesive way. If I just adjust the volume, there is a danger that by manually adjusting to what sounds quote-unquote good in the moment, I end up with 3 recordings that are wildly different in terms of amplitude. That will make the final edit much more difficult. So, in this instance, we've gone from the initial recording, and we've then used equalization, normalization, cleanup, compression, and normalization, or ENCCN. That is my basic audio editing process. Give this a go, record some audio and start playing around, see how you can use this process, see how you can adapt it to your needs. Let me know in the comments how it goes and if you run into any challenges.